Today's special guest is returning, John Boyle, but he's here today with a brand new book called Invisible Wounds. So we're talking about the difference between PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So if you've never heard these terms before, that's fine. We're going to dive into them, but also how some of your physical or mental health symptoms could actually be disguised presentations of complex post-traumatic stress disorders.
Tension? A racing mind. What if a few minutes could reset your nervous system? Biblical breathwork, scripture, worship, and nervous system science to restore your peace. Feel your tension release. Your mind grow still. Wake up rested. Start your day from a place of calm. Feel God's peace and presence. Get your copy of Biblical Breathwork today. Every purchase gifts an album to a woman in a domestic violence shelter, because God's peace is for every woman. Inhale God's peace and imagine real freedom from anxiety and stress, because life is lighter on the other side.
Welcome to the Room to Bloom podcast, equipping you to live redefined, renewed, and restored. I'm your host, Julie Rebboah. Let's tackle this week's topic. Welcome back, John. I'm so glad you're here today.
Julie, it's great to be back. Thank you for allowing me to talk today.
Of course. And I'm so glad you're talking about this specific topic because I think it's more common than most people actually realize. So please tell us why you've written this book.
As you know, in 2023, I published a memoir about my life. And in that memoir, I was very candid about how I grew up. And it wasn't to incriminate in any way, shape, or form my parents. I just shared my experience. And I shared my experience because it really shaped my life, and not in a positive way. But what God was able to do with it was very positive. I really wanted to write a book that people who have had the same experience as me felt spoken to and not spoken about. It's my desire to demystify trauma and share with those listeners, this isn't the end of the world. This is, this is something big, and you mire in difficulty every day with it. But just to be able to share what I've done to heal. I am not a doctor or a medical health professional. I'm a survivor. And so I just want to share my experience so that others can get the right help from the right people and be able to move forward with healing.
You wanted to write a book that made survivors feel spoken to and not spoken about. And I have to say that as a childhood trauma survivor myself, one of the things that I love most about your book is that it wasn't written from a clinical perspective. In my opinion, there are a lot of books written by doctors and therapists, and so often they feel cold and clinical. But your book is written from firsthand experience. So I think this type of book is missing widely in the book space, missing in the podcast space, because survivors want to hear from other survivors that, yes, I made it through this really difficult thing, and so can you. But you had a wide variety of symptoms, and from your past podcast interview with me, you explained that you were struggling with alcohol addiction. And so you had a bunch of symptoms that you were seeking help for, but you really didn't understand how they all connected. Could you tell us more about that?
So, Julie, I just physically did not know that a non-soldier could get post-traumatic stress disorder of any form or fashion. Before I was diagnosed at 36 years old, I had absolutely no clue. So going back to when I was in 8th to 9th grade, the end of middle school, beginning of high school, that is when my symptoms started to occur. I'm just living life as a high school kid. I'm trying to be a decent football player. I'm trying to lift weights and get in shape. I'm trying to do my homework every night. I'm just living from day to day. And really my first incursions were unexplainable reactions to stimuli, toxic shame. And really that's not a symptom, but it's a result, as you know, of growing up in a home that is less than kosher. Insomnia was my big one. Really 9th and 10th grade, that was the predominant symptom I had. And why I explain these is They weren't constant symptoms. I'd have bouts, I'd have days where I didn't sleep much, and then I'd crash and sleep a ton. Or I would have these strong feelings in my body without words. I now know them as flashbacks and dysphoric feelings. But then I didn't know. And so when I had these incursions of difficulty, it would ebb and flow. And it was so confusing to not be sleeping 1 month and then turn around and be anxious and irritable, but get plenty of sleep the next month. And why would I walk beside a female teacher who had a certain type of perfume and be automatically triggered, right? Or I would see a film, a scene on a film and think, wow, I'm a bad place. I need to go back to my dorm room, right? I would have these things that just didn't make any sense. And the more I experienced them, the more I felt I needed to hide them. And when I got to my senior year of high school, going into my first year of college, I worked on a roadway construction crew with guys that were 20 or 30 years older than me. And so at 18, I was driving to a construction job and starting a job at 6 a.m. They treated me like anybody else. Said, hey, do you want to have some beers after work? And so I started to figure out that these symptoms, wherever they were coming from, that I could mask them with alcohol. And that ended up being a very poor choice later in.
Well, I thank you for sharing those, because it sounds like it started early on for you, as far back as 7th, 8th, 9th grade, and it built from there. And so I can see how that would be really confusing, but I was hoping you could explain a little bit more about what toxic shame is, because there is a lot of shame that surrounds childhood trauma.
You're absolutely correct. And going back to your plug earlier about a survivor writing a book versus a therapist writing a book, a clinician would explain toxic shame as a phenomenon that happens when a child is young and there's a caregiver. The child connects very early to, this is my caregiver. When I cry, mom picks me up or grandma picks me up. If I'm hungry, dad feeds me, right? This is where I get toys from. This is who turns the TV on when I want to watch TV. So there's an automatic parallel between needs of a child and a parent, right? And it should be that way. Toxic shame happens when that same caregiver, the one who's supposed to be protecting you, doesn't protect you. Instead, they do you harm, but they still care for your needs to some degree. You can't let a kid go to school who's soiled themselves. You can't let a kid go to school with bruises and cuts all over them, right? So it's hidden. And the child really thinks it's their fault over time. And that same belief system pervades them in adulthood. It becomes a difficulty beyond explanation. So this is where the survivor part really comes in. When I first was diagnosed with PTSD, I bought 2 books, one by a guy named Pete Walker, who was a mental health professional and also a survivor, who wrote a book called Surviving and Thriving with C-PTSD. He really wrote a book from the survivor's vantage point, which opened my eyes to how much this really pervades your life. And then on toxic shame, there was a book written by John Bradshaw called The Shame That Binds Us. He was a mental health professional down in Florida. When I read John's book, I'm like, holy cow, this has affected my relationships with my friends. This has affected my relationships with my loved ones. This has affected my relationships with the 2 women I've been married to in my life. This has affected the relationships with my children. And what it says is, you're not wanted. You're not lovable. When you make a mistake, you're not worthy, right? And that's why Christianity was so important for me, Julie. Because it says differently.
It absolutely does. It redefines us, doesn't it?
Amen.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm so glad that you brought up the point that there's so many that think PTSD only happens with the veteran population, which is true. It does happen a lot in that population, but that's often associated more with a one-time traumatic, whereas complex post-traumatic stress disorder differs because it happens over and over and over again. And as you were saying, it defines how a child would think about themselves, how they believe what their role is in a relationship. I have to prevent this from happening. This was my fault. It's my job to take care of this situation. And so that's where a lot of the shame comes in. And so I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on CPTSD from your perspective and what it really meant for you and how you discovered how this is actually what you had, that nothing was wrong with you, that, this is a result of the way that you were brought up.
That's correct. I met my first wife around the age of 25 or 26. And up until that point, really, I'd lived alone after college. And so many of the symptoms that I dealt with and the ebb and flow of those, no one saw. This was something that happened behind closed doors. And so when I got married and my wife moved in, well, she started to see things that were happening inside me that didn't happen to someone who didn't have this experience. My wife would come up behind me and give me a kiss on the back of the head when I was watching a football game or a basketball game, or she'd give me a hug when I wasn't looking at her. And I would automatically tense up and flinch. And she's just trying to show me love. Right. And be supporting and say, I see you and hello. And so there were other things, the insomnia. I would have reactions to things when I felt trapped. Even when I was like unloading a dishwasher, if things would get stuck in there, I would not have the patience I had now. Let's just say that. And so she would witness these things, and she started to share with me and one of my best friends, hey, there may be something to this. But she knew my childhood, but she didn't know it was connected. But thankfully, she had an experience that she went and saw mental health professionals in college, and that's where she sent me. So I went to my family doctor, who I knew well. And here is where the problem started. And here is why I was misdiagnosed for over a decade. 25 years old, I go into my family doctor and I say, I'm not sleeping. I didn't want to give him the whole breadth of symptoms because I thought I would end up in a mental ward. When I was growing up in a small town in Kingwood, West Virginia, in my church, we would go sing Christmas carols to people in the mental ward in the state institution. And it was scary. And I didn't want to end up there. So going in and having a disguised presentation worked against me. It worked against me because I wasn't forthcoming that there were multiple symptoms. And so when I went back into the doctor, when the sleeping medication began to lose its luster and I became immune to it, I would say, I'm still not sleeping. Well, why aren't you sleeping? Is there a feeling in your stomach? Are you stressed? Are you worried? Are you sad? Some days, can you not get out of bed even though you haven't slept? So there was these diagnoses of anxiety disorder. You're depressed. Let's give you these SSRI medications on top of your sleeping medication. And so the disguised presentations just gave me a lot of medication and a lot of labels to what was going on that were inaccurate. And it was just like painting over rust. They weren't working. So eventually I stopped doing it. I said, I'm going back to alcohol. I learned at 18 that that's going to cover up my symptoms. And I just started drinking every day. So going back to your question about the experience with PTSD, really, you need to go in to your doctor or your mental health professional and say, I'm having symptoms I can't explain. They are these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I would like to explore whether trauma is involved. Could we please look at this through a trauma-informed lens? And so what I've learned about the disorder, the mental disorder of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD, is that really it's a result of chronic uncontrolled stress during childhood. It's what happens again when the caregivers that are supposed to take care of you do your harm. So basically what happens is when a child is subjected to uncontrolled chronic stress, it changes the architecture of the developing brain. It rewires the neural networks, it rewires the neuropathways and the sensory pathways to allow the child to adapt and be able to survive in a highly stressful situation that child should not be in. That's the result. The real true difference in what I've studied between CPTSD and PTSD is the wiring. PTSD occurs for the most part to an adult. With a child and CPTSD, it's a bit different because there's all these emotional things that are wrapped up into this, where you don't feel loved, you don't feel wanted, you have dysphoric feelings. It is very hard to overcome something when the wiring in your body has been disassociated and changed, and you are reacting to things that you have no control over. Sights, sounds, smells, and so on. Touches, anything with the sensory system in the body. So, that's really how I look at it.
Well, I thank you for sharing that because you really gave us some good examples of what was happening with you. both C-PTSD and PTSD are serious and they do need significant support, but there is hope. One thing that I wanted to mention was that you said you went to your doctor for insomnia and you were afraid that if there was more to this insomnia, you were afraid that you would end up in the mental institution, and that's a valid fear. Today, we've got more options, and there's an integrative healthcare system, which is what I would recommend for people to see their doctor for physical symptoms to see if there is a physical reason for that insomnia or that physical health symptom. Also, to see your mental health care provider to see if maybe there is something like trauma that is causing those symptoms. That's called psychosomatic, where things we've experienced land in the body. And so when we have this whole integrative healthcare approach, we can see a bigger picture and really figure out which puzzle pieces fit better together so that we can get the right care from the right professionals. Beyond that, what do you think you would suggest to listeners?
Well, one thing that's helped me in the process is for years, because of my childhood, I put God at bay, right? I was someone who went to church on a regular basis, but as I got out of college and went into adulthood and these symptoms just became more pronounced and more difficult and the ebb and flow became exacerbating, I just look at it and I say, man, I just don't feel like these people that are smiling and happy in church. I just had a lot of internal shame and I was down on myself a lot. So why I say that is just, having compassion for yourself, understanding that if you went through something like this, Julie, whether it's you and I or anybody, any of your listeners, it was not your fault. It was not my fault. And for your listeners, it's not your fault either. That was a crime perpetrated on you. And trust me, there is going to be a judgment day. And the Lord is going to take care of that. So I feel very confident of that. That's why I talk about Christianity, because it gave me peace. It gave me purpose. It gave me passion. And honestly, it gave me the internal fortitude to speak up and say, this is not my fault. This happened to me. And I need help. I need help in figuring out how to overcome alcohol addiction. I need help in healing from these symptoms. Christianity really was the catalyst for me to have the willpower to want to address it. That there was a bigger purpose for me, that there was a reason why I went through this. And I was always questioning, why me? Why did I have to have these things happen to me?
And I think self-compassion is really key, but that can be hard when shame is so ingrained. But as you were discussing earlier, that's where nervous system work can be so powerful, because it helps us to rewire and reroute and create brand new neural pathways. It changes our mindset because we read in the Bible to transform our minds. But the question is always, how do I do that? How do I be anxious for nothing? How do I trust God more? How do I heal when I'm not seeing any forward progress? But nervous system work is a really powerful way that we can process our emotions and discharge our emotions, that we can begin to feel safe again, because when we're in that shame spiral, we don't feel emotionally safe. And so when we pair this work with God, as you were saying, God was the catalyst for me as well for my healing. And so I'm so glad that our listeners here today are open to healing with God, but also reading books like yours, and maybe going to therapy or doing nervous system work, maybe seeing their doctor, because this is whole person care. God created us body, mind, and spirit, and we want to use each and every one of those aspects and heal it with Him by our side. So I'm so glad that you're here sharing this with us today, John.
Thank you. That was so eloquent, Julie. You need to keep going.
That's God's plan, because like you, He's using that harm for good. And even though it is so unpleasant and the healing journey can sometimes feel so long and arduous, there is light, there is hope, there is healing. And God can use that terrible situation, maybe not today, but maybe one day, like John He's written 2 books now to help other people learn what the very next step is in their healing journey.
John 8:32 just says quite simply, you shall know the truth and the truth will set you free. And that's what happened to me. I didn't know what I had. And I thought I was going to die of liver failure at 36. And my 8-year-old son wasn't going to have a dad on year 9. And that's where I was. Right. And just look at me now. Right. And it wasn't me. It was God.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad you shared that. You mentioned that there is a judgment day coming. And I know that forgiveness can be so hard for people who have lived difficult childhoods like you and like I. And forgiveness, though, God requires us to do it, but He asks us to do this because it's healthy for us. There are actually studies that show that the root of bitterness from unforgiveness causes more mental health issues like anxiety and depression, substance abuse, but also physical health symptoms like the insomnia, like autoimmune disorders, allergies, stomach issues, and heart disease, all kinds of things. And so knowing that there is a just God and we can leave our hurts and our wounds in His hands, in my opinion, is the best hands that we can leave it in. What would you say, John?
I would agree with you. The Bible verse that came to mind when you were talking was Romans 8:28. In all things, God works for good for those who love the Lord, who are called according to their purpose. And when I was miring in alcohol addiction at 36 years old, and I was told by a doctor that I was malnourished, my skin was white. I couldn't keep food down. I was told if I didn't quit drinking, I would live a very short life from here on out. And so I began to start trying to quit on my own, and I couldn't. And for the longest time, thereafter, it seemed like a long time. It was only a few weeks. I just pretty much gave up. And I was in a bar one night and a friend invited me to church and I went, and it changed my life. And very early on, when I went back to church, I heard that verse in a sermon by Tim Herring at Chestnut Ridge Church in Morgantown, West Virginia. And I thought leaving the building that day, well, that verse doesn't apply to everybody. It must only apply to those people in church who are smiling and seem like they have it all together and are blessed in a different way, right? I mean, I was back into church and I was struggling with addiction, and that's what my brain was telling me. And so as I worked up enough internal fortitude, and with the Lord's help, I went to rehab and got clean. I continued to struggle with that verse. And what I have come to understand, because I asked God to prove it to me, and He proved it time and time again, and He's still doing it. And I have a folder on my laptop of all the people who have reached out and said, you've helped me. I've had 2 United States senators who I will leave nameless, who have reached out and said, I can't tell my story, but I thank the good Lord that you've told yours. Thank you for being a messenger. I didn't expect any of this. I didn't want any of that. I didn't even want to write the book, Julie. I was called to do it. So why I say all that is it's a lot easier to forgive when you get through the difficulty, when you are able to overcome alcohol with the Lord's help, when I was able to be diagnosed with the Lord's help, when I was able to get the mental help that I needed. Then I look back on it and I'm like, wait a minute, God just brought me through something I didn't understand so I could turn around and start helping people. Okay, well, how do I start helping people? And it's just like, well, you can go speak at an AA meeting. But what I ended up doing was just writing a book and telling my story and telling the truth. So looking at forgiveness, I struggled with it for years. And really, it wasn't until after I wrote my first book and I was talking to a young man who I mentored for years, and his dad had passed away. His dad was a Baptist pastor, a man named Freedom Blackwell. His son, Canaan, sent me one of his father's sermons about forgiveness. And then Canaan and I talked about it. And Canaan shared with me what his dad told him about forgiveness. I was driving from Charleston, South Carolina to Morgantown, West Virginia, and it just hit me. Forgiveness is not something that you set one time like a cruise control or an oven temperature. It is a choice, and it's a choice every day. When you look at Jesus's teachings in the gospel, there's a story where I think Peter comes to Jesus and he says, "Teacher, how many times should I forgive my brother who sinned against me? 7 times?" Jesus says, "No, I tell you 70 times 7. Well, Jesus didn't mean literally 490 times. He meant that you're going to meet it with forgiveness every single time. So forgiveness is a choice, and you can choose to harbor hate and anger, or you can harness forgiveness and make the choice to forgive that person every time those thoughts and symptoms and ideas come in your head.
It's often a choice before it becomes a feeling. And you're right. When we experience those symptoms or flashbacks or triggers, it's an opportunity to say again, Lord, I give this to you. And I'm choosing to forgive in this moment. And you're right. Forgiveness, it is freeing and it's healthier for us, body, mind, and spirit. And so even though it's hard, God asks it because it is what's best for us. And so I just thank you so much for being here with us today, John. And if you've got one last tidbit, one last takeaway for our listeners today, what would that be?
If you've ever wondered, why am I like this? Why do I react so strongly? Why can't I just get over the past? Why do I shut down? Why do I feel unsafe even when I am safe? Why doesn't anyone understand what I'm going through? Then this book's for you. What I want you to know is that if you're going through those things, healing is possible. Julie, hope is real, as you know, and you've said, and your listeners deserve both. So I've written my book, Invisible Wounds, so that you feel spoken to and not spoken about. And it's a book to just demystify trauma and just share what I've learned. So you can find it on Amazon or Books A Million. You just type in my name, John P. Boyle, Invisible Wounds, and it will come right up.
And I would just like to say that this is not a big, thick, heavy book. It is very readable and you can get through it in just a short amount of time. But I think you really see John's heart in there and really walk away with a greater understanding of what complex post-traumatic stress disorder is and what some next steps might be for you. So thanks for being with us today. Thank you, John. God bless.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much.
This episode is brought to you by From Bud to Bloom Ministry. It is not a replacement for medical or mental health care. Please seek care from your personal care providers whenever needed. If you'd like coaching or resources, please visit ChristianNervousSystemCoach.com. And please leave a review, comment, and hit that subscribe button to share Room to Bloom with others and keep good content rolling. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, friends, live fully free in Christ.